My name is David, and I'm 37 years old. Until recently, I considered myself a happy man. I had a good job as a dispatcher at a large transportation company, where I'd worked for 8 years, steadily climbing the career ladder. My salary allowed me to support my family without significant financial worries, and my work schedule left plenty of time for home. My wife, Sarah, was a high school math teacher at a local school. Our son, Max, had just turned 6, was in kindergarten, and was getting ready for first grade. Life seemed to unfold smoothly and predictably like a well-oiled machine. Our apartment was on the 7th floor of an apartment building in a quiet residential area of Maplewood. It had 3 rooms, a kitchen, and a spacious balcony overlooking a playground and a small park. In the mornings, I'd drop Max off at kindergarten, then head to work. In the evenings, we'd gather for dinner as a family. Weekends were spent together, walks in the park, visits to Sarah's parents' cabin by Lake Willow, and sometimes trips to the movies or a play. Life flowed calmly and steadily without shocks or surprises. I cherished the stability we'd achieved and had no idea that this calm before the storm would soon end in the most horrific way. The first oddities began in late October. Sarah started coming home later than usual, citing extra lessons with struggling students or faculty meetings. At first, I didn't think much of it. Schools do have periods of increased workload, especially before holidays. But gradually, the delays became regular, and her explanations less convincing. When I called her at work, the secretary often said Sarah had already left, even though she wouldn't arrive home for several hours. To my questions, my wife would respond evasively, irritably, or sometimes just ignore them. What worried me most was the change in her demeanor. Sarah had always been an open, cheerful person who loved talking about work, sharing school news, and discussing weekend plans. Now she became quiet, withdrawn, as if absorbed in her own thoughts. Even with Max, she interacted somewhat distantly, mechanically fulfilling her parental duties but without her usual warmth and care. Max sensed this and often asked me why Mommy was so sad or if she was sick. I didn't know what to tell him. At night, Sarah often lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I'd pretend to be asleep and watch her in the dim bedroom. Sometimes she'd silently move her lips as if whispering something to herself. Other times she'd just lie still, but I could feel the tension emanating from her. Several times I tried to talk to her, asking what was wrong, if I could help. Sarah would just turn her back to me and reply curtly that everything was fine, she was just tired. But I knew that wasn't true. Something was happening to my wife, something serious and frightening. In early November, I noticed Sarah started receiving strange phone calls. The phone would ring at the most inconvenient times. Late in the evening, early in the morning, sometimes in the middle of the night. When I answered, no one would speak. Only some rustling sounds, then the dial tone. Sarah reacted nervously to these calls, grabbing the phone before me, moving to another room, and speaking quietly, almost in a whisper. It was impossible to make out her words, but her voice had a strange intonation, simultaneously frightened and submissive, as if she was pleading with someone or conversely receiving orders. After these calls, Sarah became even more withdrawn and distant. My job at the transportation company required constant attention and focus. I coordinated the movement of trucks around the city and the surrounding areas, monitored schedules, and solved various logistical problems. Usually, this work brought me satisfaction. I enjoyed the feeling of control over a large and complex system, feeling important and needed. But now, with something incomprehensible happening at home, it became difficult to concentrate. My thoughts constantly returned to Sarah, to her strange behavior, to the changes I couldn't explain. Colleagues began to notice my absent-mindedness. My boss made several remarks about errors in documents and schedule disruptions. One evening, when Sarah was once again late from work, I decided to call the school. The night watchman told me that the teachers had left 3 hours ago and there had been no meetings. I felt a chill run through me. So my wife was lying to me. But why? Where was she going for all those long hours? Who was she spending time with? Suspicions began to swarm in my head, suspicions I tried to push away, but they kept returning like persistent flies. Could Sarah be seeing someone else? Was she cheating on me? The thought of infidelity was so painful that I physically felt nauseous. We had been married for 9 years, and I had never doubted my wife's faithfulness. Sarah had always been devoted, loving, and caring. She often said I was the most important person in her life, that she couldn't imagine her existence without me and Max. Could all of that have been a lie? Or had something changed? Perhaps she had met someone else who seemed more interesting, more attractive to her. I began to analyze every word, every gesture, every glance, trying to find confirmation of my suspicions or, conversely, to disprove them. That evening, when Sarah finally came home, I carefully scrutinized her face, trying to understand if she was lying as she recounted another faculty meeting. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes, a kind of inner tension, as if she was constantly thinking about something, absorbed in thoughts important to her. To my questions about her day, she answered mechanically, monosyllabically, clearly not listening to her own words. When I tried to hug her, she subtly pulled away, not rudely but noticeably enough. This gesture hurt me more than any suspicion. My wife, who used to seek my hugs and kisses, was now avoiding physical intimacy. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to Sarah's breathing next to me. She wasn't sleeping either. I could feel it even though she lay still. An invisible wall seemed to have grown between us, getting higher and thicker with each passing day. I understood that if I didn't do something, we could lose each other forever. But what to do? How to break through this wall? How to get back the wife who was physically beside me but spiritually somewhere very far away? The next day, I decided to follow Sarah. The idea was repugnant to me. I had never considered myself a jealous person and had always trusted my wife unconditionally. But circumstances forced me to act. After work, instead of going home, I drove to the school and parked opposite the main entrance. At 4:30, teachers began to leave, and Sarah was among them. She walked quickly, nervously glancing around as if afraid someone would see her. She didn't stop at the public transport stop but continued walking towards the city center. I slowly followed her in my car, trying to keep my distance so she wouldn't notice me. Sarah turned into one of the alleys in the older part of Maplewood, where mostly private homes and small shops were located. I left my car on the main street and continued on foot. My wife stopped in front of a dilapidated 2-story house with peeling yellow paint on its walls. Scrawny birch trees grew in the yard, and the gate hung on a single hinge. The house looked abandoned, but a dim light glowed in one of the 2nd-story windows. Sarah stood for a few minutes near the gate, clearly hesitating, then resolutely opened it and entered the yard. I hid around the corner of a neighboring building and waited. Time dragged by agonizingly slowly. I looked at my watch every few minutes, but the hands seemed to be stuck. All sorts of assumptions about what my wife was doing in that strange house whirled in my head. Maybe her lover lived there. But why such an unappealing place for meetings? Or was it some secret work, a side job she didn't want to tell me about? But why hide extra income? We had never been so strapped for cash that Sarah had to seek additional sources of income. Each new theory raised even more questions to which I couldn't find answers. After 2 hours, Sarah finally emerged from the house. She looked even more tired than usual, but a strange expression shone in her eyes, simultaneously frightened and ecstatic, like someone who had just experienced something astounding. She walked slowly, as if in a daze, stopping several times in the middle of the street and standing motionless, staring into nothingness. I followed her at a distance, trying not to reveal my presence. Reaching the bus stop, Sarah got on a bus and I drove home, arriving before her. When my wife came home, I was sitting in the kitchen pretending to read the newspaper. She walked past me, barely nodding in greeting, and immediately locked herself in the bathroom. I heard the sound of running water. She was showering for over half an hour, which was completely uncharacteristic for her. Usually, Sarah showered quickly, practically without unnecessary ceremony. When she finally came out, she was in a robe, her hair wet, her skin red from the hot water. To my question about her day, she replied as evasively as always recently, citing another meeting with parents of problematic students. Over the next few days, I tried to find out what house Sarah had visited, who owned it, and what might be happening there. Online, I found the address and learned that the house was registered to a certain Valerie S. Reed, a 72-year-old retiree. No other information about her could be found. I drove past the place several times, but the house always looked empty and lifeless. Only late in the evening would a light sometimes come on in the windows. But it was impossible to see what was happening inside. The windows were covered with thick, dark curtains. My suspicions about infidelity gradually faded into the background. Sarah's behavior didn't resemble that of a woman in love. There was no secret joy, no embarrassment, no attempts to look more attractive. On the contrary, she seemed to wither before my eyes, losing interest in her appearance, in household chores, even in Max. Max increasingly came to me with questions he used to ask his mother. To help with kindergarten homework, to read a book, to play a board game. Sarah was physically present, but her thoughts were far away in some other world inaccessible to us. At work, things were getting worse. My attention was constantly scattered. I made mistakes I had never made before. One day, due to my inattention, 2 trucks almost collided on a narrow road, and only the driver's skill prevented a serious accident. My boss called me into his office and had a serious conversation about my professional suitability. I tried to explain that I was going through a difficult period in my personal life, but it sounded like pathetic excuses. Work in the transportation sector doesn't tolerate inattention. People's safety and cargo security depended on my decisions. If I couldn't pull myself together, I'd have to find another job. But how could I pull myself together when something incomprehensible and frightening was happening at home? Sarah started receiving even more strange calls, and now she answered them in front of me, not trying to hide in another room. She spoke monosyllabically. "Yes, I understand. It will be done, okay." Her voice was lifeless, mechanical, like a robot executing a program. After such conversations, she could sit motionless in an armchair for hours, staring into space, not reacting to my attempts to talk to her. Sometimes it seemed to me that she didn't even hear my words. Gradually, I began to notice other oddities. Sarah stopped eating meat, explaining it as a health concern, but she ate very little in general, as if food had lost all taste for her. She often stayed awake at night, and I heard her walking around the apartment, opening and closing doors, looking for something, or, conversely, hiding something. In the morning, to questions about her nighttime movements, she replied that she couldn't sleep and wanted to walk around the house. There was no logic in her explanations, but arguing with her became useless. She either ignored my objections or answered as if I were speaking a language she didn't understand. One day, I found a strange black-bound book in her bag with no title on the cover. The pages were covered with handwritten, incomprehensible text, either in a foreign language or just a meaningless jumble of letters. Between the pages were dried herbs I had never seen before and small objects, pieces of metal, pebbles, something resembling small animal bones. It all looked like props for some occult rituals. When I asked Sarah about this book, she snatched it from my hands with such force and fury that I never expected from her. For the first time in a long time, live emotions appeared in her eyes, but they were anger and fear. It was then that I noticed Sarah started wearing some kind of amulet around her neck, a small metal object on a thin chain which she always hid under her clothes. I couldn't properly make it out, but sometimes when she bent over or turned in a certain way, I saw the outlines of something angular and unpleasant. The metal was dark, almost black, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I tried to ask about the origin of this ornament, Sarah instinctively covered it with her hand and said it was a gift from a colleague at work. But I saw the muscles in her neck tense as she uttered these words. She was lying. Max also began to notice changes in his mother's behavior. He became more capricious, often cried for no apparent reason, and slept poorly at night. Sometimes I found him standing in the hallway in the middle of the night. He said his mom called him, but when I checked, Sarah was sound asleep in our bed. Or conversely, in the morning, Max complained that his mom had been walking around the apartment all night and disturbing his sleep, though I heard nothing. Children often sense what escapes adult attention, and my son's behavior made me think that what was happening to Sarah was even more serious than I had assumed. In mid-November, an incident occurred that finally convinced me that something terrible was happening to my wife. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, a quiet, monotonous murmur coming from Max's room. At first, I thought Max was talking in his sleep, but the sound was too low for a child's voice. I quietly got out of bed and went to his room. Sarah was standing over his crib, leaning close to his face, whispering something. The words were impossible to make out, but the intonation was incantatory, hypnotic. Max lay with his eyes open, but his gaze was empty, absent, as if he were in a trance. When I called Sarah's name, she sharply turned around. In the dim light of the children's room, her face seemed alien to me, distorted by some malice or madness. For a few seconds, she looked at me, not recognizing me, then seemed to snap out of it and quickly left the room, muttering something about wanting to check on the baby. Max, meanwhile, closed his eyes and seemed to really fall asleep. But in the morning, he looked sluggish and apathetic, complaining of a headache and nausea. I had to keep him home from kindergarten. He was clearly unwell, although he had no fever. From that moment on, I began to seriously fear for my son's safety. Whatever was happening to Sarah, whatever forces were affecting her, Max should not suffer. I tried to talk to my wife seriously, demanded explanations, but she looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. There was no understanding in her eyes, no remorse, not even anger, only emptiness, which frightened me more than any emotion. I realized that the person who had lived with me for 9 years, whom I loved and considered my closest companion, had vanished. Only a shell remained in her place, controlled by some alien will. It was then that I noticed a strange smell emanating from our apartment at night. A sweet, cloying odor, simultaneously reminiscent of rotting flowers and something chemical. The smell was barely perceptible but persistent. It permeated fabrics and lingered for hours. I checked all possible sources, the trash can, the refrigerator, the plumbing, but found nothing. It seemed as if the smell was coming from Sarah herself, from her body, from her clothes, from everything she touched. It was so unnatural that it made my head spin and my stomach churn. I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore and tried to talk to Sarah frankly. Choosing a moment when Max was asleep, I sat next to her on the couch and tried to talk about our relationship, about feeling her distance, about my worries and fears. Sarah listened to me with a stony face, showing not the slightest emotion. When I finished, she silently got up and went to the bedroom. No explanations, no attempts to justify herself or, conversely, to confess something. Just complete disregard for my feelings and words. At that moment, I understood that the woman I loved and married had ceased to exist. Before me was only an empty shell, devoid of human emotions and attachments. Over the next few days, I watched Sarah even more closely, trying to find any clues that might help me understand what was happening to her. I noticed she started performing strange actions that defied logical explanation. For example, she could stand by the window for hours, staring into space, even though there was nothing special there, just a regular yard with a playground and garages. Sometimes she would suddenly turn her head, as if listening to sounds I couldn't hear. Her gaze would become tense and focused, like an animal sensing danger. Sarah behaved especially strangely in the kitchen. She could open the refrigerator and stand in front of it for several minutes without taking anything out, then abruptly slam the door shut and leave, or turn on the water in the sink and stare at the stream so intently as if it held some secret messages. Several times I caught her sorting through knives in the kitchen drawer, feeling the blades with her fingertips. When I asked what she was doing, Sarah replied that she was just looking for the right knife to cut vegetables, but there were no vegetables on the table and she clearly wasn't planning to cook. At the end of November, an incident occurred that made me seriously consider the safety of our family. I came home from work earlier than usual and found Sarah sitting on the living room floor in the middle of a strange pattern laid out with candles, stones, and dried herbs. In the center of this circle lay a photograph of Max, the very one that usually sat on the dresser in our bedroom. Sarah was muttering monotonously, swaying back and forth, and the same cloying smell I felt at night was in the air, only now it was much stronger. When I called out to my wife, she didn't react immediately, as if she was in a deep trance. Then she abruptly lifted her head, and for a moment such horror flickered in her eyes that goosebumps ran down my skin. She quickly brushed away all the objects, extinguished the candles, and snatched Max's photograph, pressing it to her chest. To my demands for an explanation, Sarah replied incoherently, something unintelligible about attempting meditation to relieve stress. But I saw that it was a lie. Her hands were trembling, her voice cracking, and her gaze darted around the room like a cornered animal. That night I didn't sleep a wink, pondering what I had seen. The circle of candles and stones, the child's photograph in the center, strange incantations, all of it strongly resembled occult rituals I had read about in books or seen in movies. But this was in real life, in my home, involving my wife and using my son's photograph. Whatever was happening to Sarah, it directly concerned Max, and I couldn't allow it. I needed to act, but how? Who could I turn to for help? How could I explain what was happening to people who would think I was crazy? The next day, I tried to find information about the house Sarah was visiting. In the city administration archives, I managed to find out that the house did indeed belong to Valerie S. Reed, but the woman had died 3 years ago. Officially, the house was empty. There were no heirs, and it was supposed to revert to the state after all formalities were completed. But if the house was empty, who was living there now? Who was turning on the lights in the windows in the evenings? And most importantly, what was my wife doing there 2 or 3 times a week for several hours? I decided to follow Sarah again, but this time to act more decisively. On Thursday evening, I drove to the school again and waited for my wife to leave work. As before, she headed to the old part of Maplewood, to that very house with peeling paint. But this time, I didn't stay on the street. A few minutes after Sarah entered the yard, I quietly crept up to the house and tried to peer into the windows. The first floor was dark and seemed uninhabited, but on the second floor a light was on and some sounds came from there, muffled voices rustling, sometimes something resembling singing or chanting. Circling the house, I found a spot where I could get close to a second-story window. An old apple tree grew almost flush against the wall, and I could climb high enough on its branches. The wood creaked under my weight but held. Reaching the necessary height, I carefully peered into the window between the loosely drawn curtains. What I saw surpassed all my most terrifying assumptions and was forever etched in my memory with nightmarish details. In the room, illuminated by many candles, about 10 people sat in a circle, men and women of various ages, all in dark clothing. In the center of the circle stood an altar, black fabric on which lay strange objects, bones, dried animals, metallic symbols that painfully cut the eye with their sharp angles. Near the altar stood an elderly woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was gaunt with deep wrinkles, but her eyes burned with a fanatical fire. She was saying something, but the words were in an unknown language, guttural and repulsive to hear. Sarah sat in that circle between 2 other women, and I saw with horror that her face bore the same expression of blind fanaticism as the other participants in this gathering. She repeated some words after the elderly woman, swaying in rhythm with the others. In her hands was the same black book I had found in her bag, and she occasionally glanced at it as if it were a prayer book. This entire ritual was so unnatural and sinister that I felt a chilling terror deep inside, but the worst was yet to come. The elderly woman, who was clearly the leader of this group, took a child's photograph from under the altar and showed it to all the participants in the circle. Even from a distance, I could see that it was a photograph of a little boy about 5 or 6 years old. The woman began to speak something in the same incomprehensible language, and the other participants in the ritual repeated some words after her that sounded like curses. I realized they were performing some kind of incantation over the child in the photograph, and I dreaded to think what they might have been doing with Max's photograph when I caught Sarah with her strange manipulations at home. Suddenly, the elderly woman raised her hand, and everyone fell silent. She began to speak, but now in English, and her words made my blood run cold. She spoke of the need for sacrifice, of how dark forces demanded payment for their help, of how the time had come for a great ritual. She said that each person present must contribute to the common cause, and that the sacrifice must be the most precious thing to each of them. Only then would their pleas be heard. Only then would they receive what they had so long sought. Sarah listened to these words with an expression of complete submission on her face, nodding in agreement. When the elderly woman addressed her directly, asking if she was ready to do what was required of her, my wife answered affirmatively, in a firm voice, without the slightest hesitation. At that moment, I realized that Sarah was completely under the influence of this cult, that her will was suppressed, and her consciousness clouded by some suggestions or drugs. The woman who had been my loyal companion and loving mother for 9 years had turned into a zombie, ready to carry out any command of her new masters. The ritual continued for about an hour, but I couldn't bear to watch it anymore. Carefully descending from the tree, I hurried to my car, trembling with terror and revulsion. Now I knew what had been happening to Sarah all these weeks. She had fallen into a cult involved in dark practices, and she was completely under their sway. But the most terrifying thing wasn't even that. It was the fact that these people clearly planned to use children in their rituals. And by the looks of it, Max could become one of their victims. At home, I couldn't rest, consumed by anxiety and fear. When Sarah returned, she looked even more detached than usual, as if a part of her soul had remained in that cursed house. She walked past me without a word and locked herself in the bathroom. I heard her showering for a long time, as if trying to wash away something invisible and repulsive, but no amount of water could cleanse her of the defilement she had willingly embraced. I lay awake all night contemplating my next move. Going to the police seemed pointless. Who would believe a story about a satanic cult planning to sacrifice children? I needed evidence, and I had none. Trying to dissuade Sarah also seemed hopeless. She was entirely under the influence of these people. The only thing I could do was protect Max. But how? How could I protect my child from his own mother, who might have already received orders to harm him? The next day, as I dropped Max off at kindergarten, I asked the teachers not to release him to anyone but me. I explained it as a family issue without going into details. I also spoke with the parents of friends Max sometimes stayed with, asking them to look after him if necessary. All these precautions felt insufficient, but I had no other options. That same evening, an event occurred that finally convinced me there was no more time for deliberation. Sarah received a phone call, after which she started getting ready to go out despite the late hour. When I asked where she was going, my wife replied that she had an important work-related meeting. But schools had been closed for hours and there could be no urgent business there. I realized Sarah was being summoned to the cult, possibly to receive final instructions regarding Max. After seeing my wife to the door, I quickly dressed and followed her. This time I decided to act more decisively. Simply observing wasn't enough. I needed to get evidence of what was happening. I had an old voice recorder with me, which I sometimes used at work to record important phone conversations. If I could record at least part of their ritual, it would be strong evidence to take to law enforcement. Reaching the house, I saw a light on the second floor, and the same sounds as last time emanated from it. Climbing the tree, I turned on the recorder and pressed it against the window pane. The recording quality wasn't great, but the main words could be discerned. What I heard exceeded all my fears and compelled me to act immediately. The elderly woman was giving specific instructions to the ritual participants about what needed to be done with the children in the coming days. The date was explicitly named: tomorrow night, the place, the same house, the time, midnight. Sarah was given the personal task of bringing Max. I barely managed to keep myself from falling from the tree in horror. So my worst suspicions were confirmed. The cult planned to use my son in some sacrificial ritual. I had less than a day to prevent it. Descending to the ground, I rushed to my car, my thoughts racing frantically for a solution. Going to the police still seemed useless. Who would believe such a story without solid evidence? And by the time they investigated and verified my words, it might be too late. At home, I found Sarah standing in Max's room over his sleeping form. She was leaning close to his face, whispering something. The same incomprehensible words I had heard at the cult house. Max was sleeping restlessly, tossing and turning, sometimes whimpering in his sleep. When I entered the room, Sarah turned around, and in the dim nightlight I saw her face. It was the face of a stranger. Empty, lifeless eyes, features distorted by some inner struggle, thin lips moving in a silent prayer or incantation. The woman I loved had completely disappeared, leaving only an obsessed shell. To my question about what she was doing there, Sarah replied in a monotonous voice that she was preparing our son for an important event that would change his entire life. There was no maternal love in her words, no regret, only a cold determination to carry out the assigned task. I realized that talking to her was useless, that human feelings no longer held any meaning for her. There was only one thing left to do: physically prevent her from harming Max. That night, I didn't sleep a wink, guarding Max's room. Sarah tried to enter several times, but each time she ran into me. We didn't speak. We only looked into each other's eyes, she with cold malice, I with desperate resolve to protect my child at all costs. By morning, I had made my final decision. I needed to get Max far away from home, hide him in a safe place until I could figure out how to stop this cult. In the morning, as usual, I took Max to kindergarten, but instead of going to work, I drove to my parents' house in a neighboring town. I told them about family problems without going into details and asked them to keep Max for a few days. My parents agreed, though they were surprised by the suddenness of my request. Max was happy to see his grandparents, and I thought at least he would be safe while I dealt with Sarah. Returning home, I found my wife in an unusually agitated state. She was pacing around the apartment, searching for something, overturning things, looking into every corner. When she realized Max wasn't home, such fury flared in her eyes that I instinctively recoiled. For the first time in a long time, Sarah spoke to me, but these were not the words of a loving wife, but threats and curses. She demanded to know immediately where Max was, screaming that I had no right to interfere with important business, that for my interference, I would pay more than I could imagine. I didn't respond to her threats, but inside everything tightened with fear. In Sarah's voice, there were not only her own emotions, but also something alien, malicious, as if some inhuman entity was speaking through her. She grabbed the phone and started making a call, speaking in the same incomprehensible language I had heard during the rituals. By her intonation, it was clear she was reporting the problems and asking for instructions. After the call, Sarah locked herself in the bedroom, and I heard her walking around muttering something, sometimes screaming. The sounds were so chilling that my hair stood on end. It seemed as if not a person, but some demon had taken residence in our apartment, tormented by the inability to fulfill its purpose. I realized this couldn't go on for long. Either Sarah would completely lose her mind, or she would find a way to get to Max. That evening, my wife came out of the bedroom, and I saw with horror that she was holding a large kitchen knife. Her face was distorted beyond recognition. Her eyes burned with madness, and her lips were stretched into a terrifying grimace that could hardly be called a smile. She slowly approached me, and at that moment I realized that my wife had completely transformed into a monster, ready to kill me to get to our child. I tried to take the knife from her, and a struggle ensued between us. Sarah fought with incredible strength, as if something inhuman had possessed her body. She scratched, bit, tried to reach me with the blade, all the while screaming something in that cursed language. In the end, I managed to wrench the weapon from her, but she didn't calm down. She lunged at me with her fists, trying to gouge out my eyes. I had to push her away, and she fell, hitting her head on the edge of the dresser. Sarah lay motionless on the floor, a puddle of blood slowly spreading from beneath her head. I rushed to her, checked her pulse. Her heart was still beating, but very weakly. Calling an ambulance, I tried to stop the bleeding, but the injury was severe. While the medical team was on its way, Sarah regained consciousness several times and each time tried to say something. The words were incoherent, but from her lips I read Max's name and some threats. At the hospital, doctors fought for Sarah's life all night, but they couldn't save her. The traumatic brain injury was too severe. I sat in the hospital corridor, unable to believe what had happened. The woman I had loved for 9 years, who had given me a son, who had been the meaning of my life, died by my hand. Yes, it was an accident. Yes, I was defending myself, but the fact remained. I had killed my own wife. The police who arrived at the doctor's call spoke with me for a long time. I told them about Sarah's strange behavior in recent weeks, about her attacking me with a knife, about the blow being accidental during the struggle. There were enough marks on my body to confirm the assault, and the neighbors had heard shouts and sounds of struggle from our apartment. The case was classified as necessary self-defense, but it did not alleviate my mental torment. I buried Sarah completely alone. Max was too young to understand what was happening, and my wife's relatives blamed me for her death, despite the investigative findings. Standing by the grave, I tried to remember the woman my wife had been before dark forces intervened in her life. But only images from the last few weeks surfaced in my memory. The detached face, empty eyes, threats and curses. It felt as if I was burying a stranger, and the real Sarah had disappeared long before her heart stopped beating. After the funeral, I thought the nightmare was over, that Sarah's death would put an end to this whole cult story. But I was terribly mistaken. A week after the funeral, strange events began, showing me that the forces that had taken over my wife were not going to retreat. First, there were phone calls, silent, but I felt someone's presence on the other end of the line. Then letters started arriving without a return address, containing photographs of Max taken in various places, by the school, at the playground near my parents' house. I realized that the cult had not forgotten about my son, that they were somehow watching us and waiting for the right moment to carry out their plans. Attempts to find the senders of the letters and figure out who was watching Max yielded no results. These people were cunning and cautious. They skillfully covered their tracks and operated from the shadows. The only thing left for me to do was to keep Max under constant supervision and hope that eventually they would leave us alone. But my hopes were in vain. In late December, when I picked my son up from kindergarten, the teacher told me that an elderly woman had come for Max, claiming to be a distant relative. She asserted that I had asked her to pick up the child, but the teacher, remembering my instructions, refused to hand Max over to a stranger. From the description, I realized it was the same cult leader I had seen during the rituals. The incident at the kindergarten forced me to make a radical decision. I could no longer risk Max's safety by leaving him in a city where these people operated. I quit my job, sold the apartment and all our belongings, and my son and I moved to another region, far away from where this whole tragedy had unfolded. I chose our new home carefully, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where it would be difficult for strangers to appear unnoticed. For several months we lived peacefully. Max started a new school and I found a job at a local transportation company. Gradually, the wounds began to heal. Max almost forgot about the tragic events, and I learned to live with the burden of guilt for Sarah's death. Sometimes I even thought the nightmare was truly in the past, that we had started a new life, free from the persecution of dark forces. But cruel fate had one last, most terrible blow in store for us. In early summer, when Max turned 7, I noticed he started acting strangely. He often talked to himself, claiming he was speaking with his mom, who visited him at night. At first, I thought these were just normal childhood fantasies, a way to cope with the loss of his mother. But gradually, his behavior became more and more disturbing. Max began drawing strange pictures. Black circles with incomprehensible symbols, stick figures with distorted faces, houses surrounded by fire. When I asked what they meant, he replied that his mom had taught him these drawings, that they helped her find her way to us. There was no childish innocence in his words, and his voice sometimes sounded unnervingly serious, almost adult. Terror gripped me at the thought that the dark forces that had possessed Sarah were now trying to reach our son through her image. The culmination came on one July night. I woke up to a strange sound coming from Max's room, a quiet, monotonous murmuring that seemed familiar. Entering Max's room, I saw a sight that made my blood run cold. My son was sitting on the floor in the middle of a circle made of his toys, whispering something in the very language I had heard during the cult's rituals. His eyes were open, but his gaze was empty, absent, as if he were in a trance. I tried to wake him, shaking his shoulders, calling his name, but Max didn't react. He continued to mutter incomprehensible words, swaying from side to side, exactly as Sarah had done during her nightly rituals. At some point, Max turned his face to me, and I saw with horror in his childlike eyes the same fanatical fire that burned in the eyes of the cult members. It was the gaze of an adult, possessed by some insane idea, a gaze that was completely out of place for a 7-year-old child. Suddenly, Max spoke, but his voice changed. It became low, hoarse, completely unlike a child's. He uttered a few phrases in English, and these words made me shudder with dread. Max said that his mom was calling him to her, that the time had come to complete what hadn't been done before, that the sacrifice would still be made, despite all my attempts to prevent it. In his voice, there were not only childish inflections, but also something alien, malicious, as if Sarah herself or the forces that controlled her were speaking through the child. I grabbed my son in my arms and shook him, trying to bring him out of the trance. Gradually, Max's gaze began to clear, a childlike expression returning to his face. He cried, not understanding what was happening to him, complaining of a headache and nausea. I put him back to bed, but I couldn't calm down until morning. It became clear that the dark forces had found a way to reach my son, using the image of his dead mother. Max was in mortal danger, and I didn't know how to protect him. The next day, I approached a local priest, told him what was happening, and asked for help. Father Michael was an elderly, experienced man. He listened carefully and agreed to perform an exorcism. But when we came to Max, the boy fell into such a hysteria at the sight of the priest that the ritual had to be postponed. The child screamed that he didn't want to be separated from his mom, that the priest was a bad person who wanted to harm him. The following night, an event occurred that finally broke my will to resist. I woke up and found Max wasn't in bed. Searching the entire apartment, I couldn't find the child. The front door was open, the lock unbroken. Max had left voluntarily. I rushed out to search, combed the entire neighborhood, but Max was nowhere to be found. In a panic, I called the police, explained the situation, and a search operation for the missing child began. Max was found 3 days later in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The boy was alive, but in a state of deep shock. He couldn't explain how he got there, only claiming that his mom had called him there, that they were supposed to meet for an important matter. Traces of several people's presence were found in the house, remnants of candles, strange symbols drawn on the walls. Everything indicated that some rituals had been performed there, but the participants themselves could not be found. The doctors who examined Max said that physically the boy was unharmed, but his mental state was a serious concern. He became withdrawn, often spoke to invisible interlocutors, and drew the same strange symbols as before. No amount of persuasion or explanation helped. Max was convinced that his mother was alive, that she needed his help, and that they would soon be together again. The following months turned into a true nightmare. Max tried to run away from home several times. He was found in the most unexpected places, always claiming he was going to meet his mother. The psychologists and psychiatrists I consulted shrugged their shoulders. Such cases were extremely rare, and standard treatment methods didn't help. The boy seemed to be under the influence of some external force that was stronger than any medical drugs or therapeutic techniques. The tragic culmination came in October, exactly 1 year after the whole cult story began. Max once again disappeared from home at night, but this time the search lasted a week. When he was finally found, it was too late. The boy's body was discovered in the same abandoned house where he had been found the first time. Apparently, the child had gone there voluntarily and spent several days in the cold building without food or water. The official cause of death was hypothermia, but I knew the truth. My son had fallen victim to the dark forces that turned my wife into a monster and through her reached our child. There were no signs of violence on Max's body, but his face expressed not suffering, but a kind of peacefulness. As if in the last moments of his life he had finally met the one he had sought for so long. In his hands, the boy clutched a photograph of Sarah, the very one I had once seen during her strange rituals at home. How the photo got to the child remained a mystery. I was sure I had destroyed all traces of my wife's occult activities. Now I sit in an empty apartment, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer exists. My family is destroyed. My wife is dead by my hand. My son perished from the influence of forces I could not understand or stop. I often think about what I could have done differently, how I could have saved Sarah from the cult's influence, how I could have protected Max from the dark entities that pursued us even after his mother's death. Sometimes at night I imagine I hear familiar voices, Sarah's and Max's, calling me to join them. In such moments I realize that the ending of this story has not yet been written, that the dark forces that destroyed my family will not leave me in peace either. Perhaps they are waiting for me to finally break under the weight of guilt and despair, when I become as pliable a tool in their hands as Sarah was. Perhaps sooner or later I will follow my wife and son into that gloomy world where they now reside, and then the sacrifice will finally be made, and the dark entities will receive what they have so long sought. For now I still hold on, clinging to the remnants of sanity and the will to live, but I feel my strength leaving me with each passing day. Perhaps this is the most sophisticated revenge of those forces that took everything dear to me. Not to kill me quickly, but to slowly destroy me from within, forcing me to live with the knowledge that I could not protect my family. One way or another, the story of David's family is coming to an end, and that end can be nothing but a tragedy.